Welcome. My name is Steve Stein, and I'm the host of the Street Smart Wisdom podcast. Today we have a special guest, Dr. T. Colin Campbell, author of many books and some really world-changing research. And we're going to talk a little bit about his most recent book, The Future of Nutrition, and also some of the health-related things happening in current events. Dr. Campbell, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Looking forward to it.
Excellent, excellent. So how about sum up 60 years of work in 5 minutes? I'm just kidding. No, tell us a little bit about your background. Then we're going to get into not only your thought process, but how it's relevant to the pandemic and vaccines and stuff like that. But tell us a little bit about, the book and your process in general.
Okay, so in the beginning, it was both personal and professional. I went to graduate school at Cornell University in essentially nutritional biochemistry. And my doctoral dissertation, quite frankly, was on, in a sense, advancing the consumption of more protein, especially high quality protein that only comes from animal food. Okay. My original training and teaching, lecturing and so forth at the university was also with that same idea in mind. That was consistent with my background. I was raised on a farm. I grew up milking cows, doing a farm life.
Where was that?
In Northern Virginia, just not too far from Washington, D.C., 50 miles west of Washington. But in any case, I was on a farm. That's what my life was. That's what my dad and my grandfather, and so forth and so on. So the idea of producing milk, meat, and eggs is largely about making sure we get enough protein, okay? That was my doctoral dissertation, as I said, published, of course. Then after that, when I took my first faculty position at Virginia Tech, the Department of Nutrition and Biochemistry, I was also asked to be the coordinator for a really interesting project in the Philippines, funded by the U.S. State Department, developing a model for feeding malnourished and starving children. And the idea there was, not just ours, but everybody in my community, these kids didn't get enough protein, okay? So that was part of the object of our work, to make sure they got enough protein. But I saw something that was at odds. What I thought I saw, and then it was sort of supported by some work in a laboratory in India, was that the kids who got the most protein, there weren't many, the families who had the most protein in the Philippines, like we do, those kids had a higher risk of getting liver cancer, of all things. Kind of an odd, out of the way kind of observation, but for sure it wasn't hardly believable. So I brought the idea home to my laboratory at Virginia Tech. I got money from the National Institutes of Health. The first grant lasted 27 years. And there were other grants too. But in any case, that gave me a chance to really dig into this question. Is it true that high protein consumption was a risk factor for liver cancer or any cancer? The whole idea was that, I had a puzzle. Myself and my colleague, who was senior to me at the time, but in any case, that couldn't be resolved. I had to do research on it. So we got the grant, was experimental animal studies. I wanted to see if that's true. And sure enough, we got into it. Yes, we could turn on the cancer, was started by a mutation, basically. But we could start up, once the cancer started, we could turn the cancer growth on and off, simply by giving more animal protein or decreasing it or replacing it with plant protein. So it was dramatic. And as I got into the biochemistry of this effect, some detail, sort of asking the question, well, how does this work? Can this be true? Because it's at odds with who I am, my training, and the training of everyone around me. And so sure enough, it was very clear. It was dramatic. We could turn on cancer by feeding more animal protein, period. And of all things, it was protein of cow's milk. I'm come from the farm, so put yourself in that position. So then I started looking for so-called mechanisms like we do in biochemistry. That's the way the whole system works. If you have a cause and effect and you see something odd, one of the things you really want to do, is there any reason for this? Is there any way you can explain it? So I started looking for mechanisms with my students, my graduate students over the years. After about 10, 12 years or so, every time we looked for a mechanism, we found one, which is really odd. There wasn't one that I could put my finger on, that might be treated, let's say, by a drug or something silly like that. All these mechanisms were popping up here and there and coming from different.
What do you mean by mechanism? If-then kinds of things? Or?
I'll name a couple. When a chemical carcinogen is consumed, let's say, and it initiates the cancer, the first mechanism was that the high protein diet increased the rate of entry of the carcinogen into the cell. Number one. Number two, when carcinogens get inside of cells, they are metabolized by an enzyme. Okay? They're converted to a product that's a detoxification product or to a product that's very active. Well, it turned out high protein diets increase the activity of that enzyme. Okay, so more of the enzyme, more of the carcinogen now is being activated. More is being detoxified too, but more is being activated. What does that mean? So we found out that. Then the next thing was, well, okay, it's activated. What happens then? Well, the activated product then binds to DNA, the stuff of genes, very tightly. Okay, we found out the high protein diet increased the amount of carcinogen binding to the genes.
Now, did it correlate? Quick question: did it correlate whether it was fish-based protein versus?
Oh, that's going too far ahead. I just said, let me jump way ahead and just sort of answer the question anyhow.
Sure.
This is unique for animal protein. And animal protein means fish protein too. It doesn't happen with plant protein, just with animal protein. Okay, so it was through several years of more of these kind of mechanisms. For one thing, feeding more protein increases the growth hormone that we have, which in fact turns on cancer. So there's another one. We have a couple of mechanisms that our body has that we all have to protect us against these things, like repairing the DNA. Well, it turns out the high protein diet depressed our ability to repair the problem. So the high protein diet really was doing everything in a way to create cancer. So I finally arrived at the conclusion, there's no such thing as a single mechanism. That's what the drug industry likes to say. All this stuff is happening together, and it's highly coordinated, beautifully coordinated, it seems, all working together. Finally, you reach a point in your mind, hey, this is true. There is no doubt about this. This cannot be disputed. So, of course, it was a unique cancer. It was an experimental animal, but you start looking around. The same thing happens for other systems too. Eventually, we got into the question concerning, well, what about humans? We kind of have to look at that too. So we had a chance of looking at that in more detail, as other researchers did. And that is it, especially we did that in China. And it turns out that if you compare a bunch of people consuming different levels of protein and how much cancer they get, it turns out as soon as animal protein is added to the diet, obviously in the form of food, as soon as that we start consuming that kind of food, the risk of cancer starts going up, up, up. A straight line relationship. Compare different countries, for example, it's dramatic. So that's pretty consistent. Then you can ask yourself a question, well, okay, it's doing that for cancer. We see breast cancer and colon cancer, kidney cancer, so forth and so on, all being related to animal protein. Very impressive. So then you sort of can ask yourself, well, wow, is that what nature's doing? Is that what animal protein does to us? You can ask some other questions like, well, what effect does it have on heart disease? Well, it turns out that's some information there that was first examined in 1909, over 100 years ago, and they ignored. Those people found that they were just dismissed, essentially. But it turns out that the high protein, animal protein diet turns on are the synthesis of cholesterol in our blood. So high protein means more cholesterol in our blood. It means more early heart disease. So you go on and on and on like this, and I'm now referring to some other folks, some colleagues. It turns out the same thing happens, let's say, with chronic kidney disease. It happens with diabetes, on and on. So I'm finally now, these many years later, not only based on the research that we were doing in my lab, and it was published and it was supported by NIH, by the way, throughout the whole process. That's the best of the best, so you know, it's that kind of agency. So in any case, we find that, and then you finally get to a point where I'm also, for about 20 years of my career, I was intensively involved in national policy development on food and health. So there I'm having an opportunity to see how does science get translated into public information. You know, I get a chance to see the agencies in the government that actually sort of set up this education scheme for us, if you will. I also, for a while, I was the liaison to Congress for the entire biomedical research community for a period of time. So I see it all the way from the laboratory to, let's say, politics, let's call it politics, more likely. And so that became sort of, I got caught up in that. Then you ask questions, well, why haven't we known this before? Nobody wants to believe that. Very few people want to believe that, you know, animal food is bad for us. I'm coming from the farm. I wasn't about to give on that either for a while. But there it is. It's inarguable. So then eventually I got around to going back and looking at some of the history. Back to the 1700s. Where did we go off the rails? Because we did. We went off the rails. And sure enough, I found some history back in 1800s that was really very, very informative. So what I just told you, you know, from the laboratory and so forth on up through it was really about our worship. I'm going to use that word worship. It's about our worship of animal protein as the supreme nutrient. And in fact, our diets in Western countries and other countries who want to be like us, what drives us in our discussion and our thoughts about food and health, what drives us in a scientific sense more than any other single thing that I can think of, it's our desire to make sure we get enough protein. And that means eating animals, meat, milk, and eggs. That's who we are. It turns out that plants have protein too, by the way. That's been known for more than 100 years. But that was pretty quickly labeled low quality. Nothing could be further from the truth. Plants have all the protein we need.
Right. I mean, this is just my anecdotal, and I respect the science of it all. But just growing up through life, you look at a horse, only eats grass, and there's no body fat. They're healthy. They're vibrant. They don't eat meat. So isn't that like an example in nature that meat protein is not necessarily good for you or the best thing for you?
Yeah, well, just think about it. What you said is absolutely true. Horses, they don't need to eat meat. They get strong and fast and big and so forth and so on. So how about cows? How about sheep? How about the hippopotamus, one massive muscle, or the rhinoceros? How about giraffes? They all survive on plant protein. They get all that muscle and speed and endurance and
longevity too, probably.
Yeah, that varies. That varies.
Okay.
But in any case, every species has its own sort of niche, you know, for a lifetime, if you will. I mean, let's be like turtles. Some say they can live to be 200 years, but whatever. I don't know that information that well.
But I had a parrot that I gave away 10 years ago when it was like 3 years old. It's going to be around for a while, most likely.
Yeah, so, I'm not, that's a hard one to really rationalize.
Right, but the point is, they're perfectly healthy, eating grass, eating
Right.
plants.
Exactly. So that's who I became. First with my work in the laboratory and talking about it that way. Hey, we got a problem here. That raises a lot of interesting questions that we haven't discussed here that relate to other matters. And in 19, my first time to really where I saw the rubber hitting the road was in 1980. Well, a little before that, I was on a couple of National Academy of Science panels. 1980, I was on a panel of 13 of us that was asked by the US Senate actually to write up a report. What do we know about diet and cancer? Because shortly before that, Senator George McGovern had chaired a committee in the US Senate concluding that, we eat too much fat and that causes heart disease. He was off the track a little bit on that because it's really animal food. But he got in a lot of trouble with that. And his friends who supported him, they didn't win their next election. The senators from the Midwestern states. Anyhow, that's what McGovern did in the 70s. We came along in the 80s. I was on this committee that was, a lot of people watched it, what we were doing, 13 of us. What are we going to say? We came up and said the same thing. We said the same thing. Eat more vegetables, eat more grains. It's about whole foods. Cut down. We said cut down on fat, which meant animal food in those days. And that really caused a storm. And I was one of the key people involved in that activity because I was the one who gave testimony to congressional committees that the committee had asked me to do, myself and a couple of other colleagues on the committee. But in any case, I did that. I got right in the middle, up to my eyebrows, and the kind of stuff that goes on in Washington and seeing where science gets translated for the public. A very sad arena, I must tell you. And that went on for some years. I've watched it obviously very closely over the years. And now I'm really quite passionate and I'm vocal about the fact that the information the public gets on health is corrupted. I'm using that word intentionally. The public is not getting the kind of information that science is able to talk about and have the public consider. I'm not one, by the way, I know in this territory here, you can get into trouble talking about what your political views might be. I'm not, that's not my game. My game as a scientist is only just tell the truth. That's all I ask. If people choose.
What do you mean? What do you mean by corrupted? Is that like, does it have anything to do with fake news, or I don't want to open up a can of worms, but it's manipulated on different levels.
I know where the worm cans are. So I try to figure out how to negotiate that pathway. But in any case, here's the story. There are, for the most part, two major government agencies who really are more responsible for what we get to know health-wise, and I should say diet-wise in a sense. But there's two agencies that provide that information. One is called the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA. They're the ones that sort of devise and update it every 5 years. They devise the so-called dietary guidelines. Here's what we say you should eat. Okay, they got a committee that works on that for good scientists, but then eventually it's processed through the wheels. And eventually at the end of the day, the secretary himself, has always been a him, the secretary himself can veto whatever the scientists may or may not say. So what do they say? So at that level, at the secretary's level, those secretaries are usually on a revolving door arrangement between agriculture and government. By agriculture, I mean raising livestock. I mean dairy. So the secretaries of agriculture are looking out for the farm industry, which I know very well. And so that's one. And let me set that aside for a second to go back to your question. The other agency is the Department of Health and Human Services. In the old days, it used to be called HEW, Health Education Welfare. But in any case, the Health and Human Services, that's a huge operation. That's taking care of our personal health and so forth and so on. One of the major agencies in that group is the NIH. Really, in principle, a wonderful institution in terms of supplying money for research to scientists. It's been the key agency in the world, actually, for many years. I think they're getting some competitors maybe these days, but in any case, the NIH is another group. I've been closely associated with that group through the years, not only getting funding, but also being on the committees of the NIH to determine who else gets the grants, if you will. So NIH is one, part of HHS, right? Another one is FDA. The public knows FDA fairly well. That's what making judgment about what drugs are approved and which ones are not. So those are the two big agencies, agriculture and health, those two. They're the ones pretty much determine what we get to know as the public. In both cases, they're headed up by the secretary, cabinet level secretary, appointed by the president. Whoever is president gets to choose what kind of person they want to have at that level. You know, oftentimes rotates every time a new president comes
Like
in.
being able to designate, like if you want a newspaper, who's the editor, who's the main editor.
Of course. So from the White House, they dictate with some advice from Congress oftentimes, but nonetheless, they will name who the secretary is going to be for those two agencies. There's a couple of other government agencies too are also involved in this too. It's the military, because they're interested in food for sure and health, you know, of all the service people. That's obviously very important. There's the Department of Education, maybe, you know, looking after kids and so forth. So to answer your question, the whole process of determining what we get to know is very much tied to reality. What is reality? Reality is the political persuasion of the day. And I can tell you, when it comes to that, as to who has the power and who doesn't have the power in our country, it comes from the corporate sector. That's obvious. They're the ones. So to carry it still a step further and say, okay, I'm a free market guy too, like most everyone else. You know, in principle, that sort of thing. But in reality, the politicians also turns out now these days are elected by who can collect the most campaign money, right? How do politicians get a lot of campaign money? Well, they better be speaking the language of their supporters or they won't get elected. Now, since 2010, the US Supreme Court had passed a decision at that time by a narrow margin, 5-4, I think it was, that big money could participate in this game. Even more or less, I'm kind of, it's a little more nuanced than that, but big money is allowed now to participate.
Yeah, it's a great synopsis, yes.
Yeah, so in reality, the ones who are running these departments who tell us what kind of information the public gets, who are these people? These are people appointed by the politics of the day. And that in turn speaks to the money of the day. And that speaks to, you know, the big loud voices, corporate America. So I could see this story all the way from molecules and cells in the laboratory to, if you will, the exercise of the exercises that are used to determine what we get to know.
So molecules to knowledge, and it's very much filtered, the knowledge. So it's fascinating history lesson. And so, and like kind of behind the scenes of how, it's a bad metaphor, in the sausage factory, how policy gets made. But it's instructive. So is there can you bring us up to speed or up to date with that? And then I want to talk about some current events.
Okay, so let me just summarize quickly what you just said. I'm talking about a nutritional effect, of course. And nutrition by definition, my definition is it's the expression of food when we consume it. That's what I consider to be nutrition. How do the nutrients in food actually work to create what they do?
The nutrition is an expression of food. Is that the term?
It's the biological expression of food.
Interesting.
No, we consume food, then it's broken down, it's digested, it's absorbed, it's metabolized, it's done this, it's done that. And so what's going on in our bodies, that's my career. That's what my business is all about, trying to understand how all that works, you see. And I arrived at the point now where we should eat plant foods. End of story, whole foods, plant foods. Okay, so, and I think that's the simplest message to bring forth to the public. Eat whole foods as much as possible. We don't want to take out the oil and the fat out of food, even though it looks good in the food. We don't want to take that out and take out carbohydrate, which is refined sugar, let's say. We don't want to take that out and mix it all up in a bowl and make a convenience food, pastries and stuff like that. That's not the same thing that I'm talking about. I'm talking about the whole food, vegetables, fruits, grains, meats. We could count meats, but meats don't work because I'm saying we don't need the protein from animal foods. We just don't need that. That's crazy. We've lived with it a long time. As I say, it's almost a sacred idea, but we don't need it.
If you, not from an environmental level, but from a health level, if you have some protein, in my experience, if I have meat protein once in a while, sometimes I feel a little pepped up from it. I know it's not great for the environment, but then if I have too much, my whole system will break down. Is there science behind that, or is that just in my head?
No, there's I think one can argue some science behind it. However, the biological part of that discussion gets confused sometimes with the psychological, behavioral. We perceive that we want certain things, and if we don't get them, we don't feel so good. So, how do you separate out that from the organic, chemical reactions, if you will? So I just want to make sure that there's a little overlap here. We can't, put everything in this bucket or this bucket kind of thing. But yeah, it's a little meat every once in a while. I guess some people say that's what they feel good about it, and they want to have it. I can't go along and say from a scientific perspective, hey, that's going to kill you. I can't say that.
From an environmental perspective, it's very, very inefficient and bad for the planet.
Bad for your body too.
Okay.
Over your lifetime, pay the price.
Because you're part of the environment. It's all connected.
Yes, they're all connected, right? So now to go back to your question, you said, how can I maybe translate that into something that's practical? What do you do about it? There's at least two, if not three things. Number one, teach nutrition in medical schools. There's not a medical school in the United States that teaches nutrition to the physicians. There's technically, the latest figures I've seen, 29% of medical schools offer 25 credit or 25 hours, I think it is, of nutrition. That's a very low number, only 29%, and 25 hours is nothing. And also it's the wrong kind of information because they're operating on the model of nutrition that includes a lot of animal protein, if you will, for starters. So medical schools don't teach nutrition.
So just to be clear, that's 25 hours over the span of 6-8 years, however long.
4 years.
It's 4 years. Okay, still, that's not much.
No, it's not much. And in fact, our undergraduates in nutrition might take as much as 200. They're taking 200 lectures just to get the undergraduate training. So the doctor's getting nothing. And number one, and number two, whatever they are getting is the contemporary knowledge of the day, which in fact is favoring the kind of diet we now use. So that's number one, teach nutrition to medical schools, and governments can actually do that. I'm not a big fan of governments doing everything. That's not my argument. But they can actually, in a case like this, they could just make sure that medical schools got to teach adequate amounts of nutrition for the physicians or they don't get extra funding from the federal government. It's very, they have a hammer that they can sort of make that happen, but they won't, because that goes against the industry.
So what's
Yeah.
number two? Number one is
Okay, number one.
nutrition in medical schools.
Yeah, number two, create a better system for doctors to be reimbursed for talking about this knowledge. I mean, a lot of physicians, maybe they weren't trained in this, but they are interested in people, of course, and improving their health. A lot of physicians will get into this and go down this road, and they want to talk about it, and they get excited about it because it has amazing effects, but they don't get adequately reimbursed.
Interesting. Okay.
So that's a big deal too. And I can sort of wrap some specific ideas around that, but in any case, that's a really important thing to do. The third thing is that the National Institutes of Health that I spoke to before, that is the key medical research funding agency in the world. That's where 90% of my funding came from. The other 10% came from other taxpayer-based agency. But in any case, the National Institutes of Health is made up of about 27 institutes and programs, one for heart disease, one for cancer, one for, let's say, diabetes, so forth and so on. These different institutes. Do you know, out of those 27 institutes, there's not one called the Institute of Nutrition?
Really?
And that is the main medical subject of all. So doctors aren't trained. They're not compensated for the work they may wish to do in that area. And we don't even have a research agency that's focused on exactly that question. I mean, just anybody, I think any person in the public who may not know anything about this, I think they find that pretty appalling. So that's one thing that needs to happen.
So those are the top three. Are there more in that?
Well, those are the top three. There's another two, I would argue, and I've been very much involved in this. It has to do with development of national policy. You know, national policy, as I said, in the area of food, usually comes out in the form of dietary guidelines run by the USDA. I think that whole program should be scrapped, start over again. It needs to be put into some kind of trust fund, if that's possible. In fact, that's what Lyndon Johnson suggested many years ago. But the industry doesn't want to allow that to happen. They want to be in a position to control this knowledge. But in any case, formulation of policy is a fourth one. It's really, really important. Easier said than done. But
and then what's the fifth, if there's a fifth?
Well, that pretty much covers the territory. If I were to add a fifth, I would say more international cooperation on this message, because this is not an American message. This is a message for people across the world, as you know. And if we could get a little more cooperation, you know, in that, either working through the WHO, the World Health Organization. It's quite a nice organization, actually, part of the United Nations. So I think that if I were to list the fifth one, is just say, yes, let's participate with our colleagues abroad in other countries. So we have one and the same kind of message.
Great. So now, as a lay person listening to this podcast or watching the video, is it just one thing? Eat a plant-based diet, or are there two or three things an individual can do for their personal wellness?
Well, for one thing, if we just abide by that idea, whole food and plant-based, two things. Eat the food in a whole food form as much as possible, and make sure it's plants. It's just that simple. Do you know there's infinite amounts of variety in that program? Some people might like kale, other people like spinach, whatever. Some people like this kind of grain, that kind of grain. Or this kind of fruit or that kind of fruit. We all have our choices. And so we can mix and match all day long the rest of our life. Plenty of variety, absolutely plenty of variety. Where it gets a little bit more personal, maybe, is I like cookies of a certain kind and somebody else likes a different kind. Or, somebody likes this kind of cake. The cake is spicy. Yeah, so you got that kind of thing going on. And I would just suggest that to if you're eating whole food, your taste eventually you come to really adapt to that taste to a point where you don't want the other stuff.
A really basic question. What does the term whole foods mean?
It means basically it's in theory, at the very bottom line, eating the whole carrot or the spinach, whatever. But in more sort of, let's say, substantive level, it means consuming all the nutrients in that food simultaneously. So we can take the food, we chop it up, we can maybe cook it some, we can, I'm not raw food kind of a person. You want to cook it some, you want to make it flavorful, okay? One of the things we should not be doing or doing at a very minimal level is adding back oil. That's what we don't need to do. We don't need to add back a lot of refined sugar either. So oil and sugar and salt, those three, we get carried away with adding that to our food because it's supposedly, it tastes better. Well, it tastes better because it's addictive. And once we get into it, we want more and more and more. And first thing you know, we're paying a price, in terms of, so we should, get used to not needing those three things as much as possible.
Excellent. I have an anecdote. I'm not going to get it exactly right, but hopefully I get the gist of it. So years ago, I used to record Dick Gregory, and he said a lot of very interesting things. But I think it was him that said, they gave someone a Nobel Prize to figure out how to bleach bread, and then they gave someone another prize to figure out how to enrich it. So it's like the food is whole to begin with, but I think that speaks to what you were talking about, the financial implications of the food chain.
That's right. Yeah, I actually met Dick Gregory myself and went to see his shows in New York and so forth. Yeah, he was very much into this sort of thing, by the way, this way of eating, as you may know. But yes, that incident, you raised a point that it's a good time for me to mention something. You said whole food?
Right.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the concept of wholeness in a nutritional sense. Nutrition tends to be defined by what individual nutrients do, how much we should consume, how much is in the label on the side of the box, this kind of stuff. We worry about, we focus our ideas on individual nutrients. Do we get enough, let's see, do we get enough saturated, oh no, not saturated fat. Do we get enough vitamin C, vitamin E? Oh, maybe that kind of stuff. That has been a rabbit hole. That is not nutrition. I call that the pharmacological interpretation of nutrition, trying to talk about individual nutrients and what they do. When you keep all those nutrients together and we're consuming the whole food, however it's chopped up and so forth, when we're consuming the whole food, we're consuming as nature provided it. And all these things work together. And that's what, talking about in the early part of our discussion, I talked about the mechanisms. When I was looking at mechanisms and realized that one nutrient, in that case, it was about animal protein, it doesn't operate by one mechanism. There's almost infinite numbers of mechanisms all working together. So what you see inside of our cells in our bodies, you see this marvelous world of complexity where nature has figured it all out, how to make all this sort of work in a way that creates, maximizes health, gives us, prevents disease. So that's the difference. So I call all that work together holism with a W, not with an H, with a W, holism that way. And the opposite of that is talking about the parts of the whole. We call that reductionism. So it's reductionism versus holism. It's an old idea, that goes back to ancient times.
Right. We covered that in our previous session, I think. But it's all integrated. It's all holistic.
Right.
So when you say holistic with a W, and my grandfather used to say, right, instead of drinking apple juice, eat an apple. I think that speaks to what you're saying, getting closer to the source as nature creates it.
Right. And you know, the results, you're absolutely right. To stay with whole food as much as possible. Obviously, we're not going to do that all the time, but you know, let's try to do it. Do it. And it turns out to be a wonderful way of living. And I, coming from the dairy farm, eat meat, milk and eggs. I was raised that way and struggling with all those early years in the profession, you know, sort of going against my own life. That's not easy. Against the lives of colleagues who do the same things, not easy. So I know how difficult it is.
So we appreciate that. So what I'm thinking is, let's wrap up this section of the conversation, and then we can get on to maybe a couple of more topical things.
Okay.
So Dr. T. Colin Campbell, thanks so much for a great discussion. And can you remind us the best place to find out more information about you and your work?
Yes, we have a nonprofit. It's with Cornell University. It's called it's in my name. Some of my colleagues put that there. T. Colin Campbell Center for Nutrition Studies. We have an online course. It's done really well. And in fact, of all the online courses that Cornell has promoted up until now, ours has been number one throughout. So again, it's an online course, 6 weeks in length, by the way. We have instructors, you know, sort of participate in the discussions as that goes forward. So it's not quite what you get in the classroom, but you know, there you have it. It was kind of comprehensive, and that's number one. Number two, we have another nonprofit we've been associated with called Plant Pure Communities. That's a collection of, I don't know what the latest count is. It's, I think, close to 500 sort of wellness groups. We call them pods. That was organized by my oldest son, who organized it with, and that is an effort to reach more people. And so there's these 500 organizations are here and abroad. And so we're excited about what that may have, how that may work. So again, Plant Pure Communities, that one. The previous one is Nutrition Studies, and it teaches the course. And then got my books, since you're asking. The China study, by the way, was first published in 2005. In that case, thanks to my wife, who insisted I should write that book. She's tired of hearing me complain about what's going on in science. So I wrote that book, and it's turned out that book is now sold well over 3 million copies.
Wow.
And it's been translated into, the official figure is 48 different languages. I've had word that there's more than that, but something like 50 foreign languages, which I think is a record. And so that book is really, I still do it now, 16 years later, and it's still doing quite well. The second book was called Whole, that's with a W. That was published in 2013. And there I got more into talking about this sort of philosophy, if you will, or the scientific data itself a little more carefully to try to defend that concept of holism. That too is done really well. It was a New York Times bestseller. And the third one I just came out with in December, called The Future of Nutrition. And that one is more getting into, in my attempt, to try to understand, why do we have so much hostility in this field? Why is there so much confusion about nutrition? And it has a history to it, fascinating history. So that book is more trying to talk about, how did we get into this mess? And in some ways, how do we get out of it? Which has been the sort of the topic of conversation that you've got us involved in. And so I'm excited about that new book. And that was done with a grandson of mine, Nelson Diesler, who graduated in English from the University of North Carolina, was the top in his class. And he's a fantastic writer. He's really had a lot to do with making the book what it is.
Wow. So how do we get out of this mess, huh? So that's,
yeah, maybe that's the time. Yeah, just put that down. How do we get out of this mess? It says, I even forget, there's my publisher sort of insists we have this. It says The Future of Nutrition, and insiders look at the science. That comes from why I haven't been so much involved in policy. And insiders look at the science, why we keep getting it wrong, and how to start getting it right. Maybe it sounds bold and audacious, and I suppose, but be that as it may, I really was interested in, just for myself and for friends and family and the rest, everybody else, how do we get involved in this mess?
All right, so I think that's a good place to stop this part of the conversation.
Okay,
Dr. T. Colin Campbell, thanks so much for a great discussion. That was excellent. Thanks so much.
okay, thank you.